Hello, my wonderful family. It is your favorite Aunt Jessie, and today I'm going to read to you The Hobbit, or There and Back Again by J.R.R. Tolkien. I hope you enjoy. Hold on, I have to get to the actual word. Sorry, it's going to take a second. Note to the text. Author's note. I wish that I had got this ready beforehand. The Hobbit, Chapter 1. An Unexpected Party. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door, like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle, and the door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel, a very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls and floor tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on, going fairly, but not quite straight, into the side of a hill. The hill, as the people for many miles around called it, and many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side, then the other. No going upstairs for the hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of these. Wardrobes. He had whole rooms devoted to clothes, kitchens, dining rooms. All were on the same floor, and indeed in the same passage. The best of the rooms were all on the left-hand side going in, for these were the only ones to have windows, deep-set round windows looking over his garden, and the meadow beyond, sloping down the river. The hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, and the people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but because they had never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without bother of asking him. This is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure, and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighbor's respect, but he gained, well, you will see whether he gained anything in the end. The mother of our particular hobbit. What is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need description nowadays, since they've become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. They are, or were, little people, about half our height, and smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There's little or no magic about them except the ordinary everyday sort, but helps them disappear quickly and quietly, and large stupid folk like you and me come blundering along, making noises like elephants which they can hear a mile off. They are inclined to be fat, like your Aunt Jessie, and dress in bright colors, chiefly green and yellow, and wear no shoes, because their feet grow naturally leathery soles, and thick warm brown hair, like the stuff on their heads, which is curly, have long clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and laugh deep fruity laughs, especially after dinner which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now you know enough to go on with. As I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, of Bilbo Baggins, that is, was the famous Belladonna Took, one of the 3 remarkable daughters of the old Took, head of the hobbits who lived in the water, a small river that ran from the foot of the hill. It is often said in other families that long ago one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. This was, of course, absurd, but certainly there was still something not entirely hobbit-like about them, and once in a while the members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. They discreetly disappeared, and the family hushed it up, but the fact remained that the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, though they were undoubtedly richer. Not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she came became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. Bungo, that was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, and partly with her money, that was to be found either under the hill, or over the hill, or across the water, and they remained to the end of their days. Still, it is probable that Bilbo, her only son, although he looked and behaved exactly like a second edition of his solid, comfortable father, got something of a bit of the queer makeup from the Took side, something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived until Bilbo Baggins was grown up, being about 50 years old or so, and living in the beautiful hobbit hole built by his father, which I have just described to you, until he had, in fact, apparently settled down immovably. By some curious chance, one morning long ago, in the quiet of the world, when there was less noise and more green, and the hobbits were still numerous and prosperous, and Bilbo Baggins was standing at his door after breakfast smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes, neatly brushed, Gandalf came by. Gandalf! If you had heard only a quarter of what I've heard about him, and I've only heard very little of all that there is to hear, you would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place wherever he went, in the most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down that way under the hill for ages and ages, not since his friend, the old Took, died. In fact, and the hobbits had almost forgotten what he had looked like. He had been away over the hill and across the water on businesses of his own since they were all small hobbit boys and hobbit girls. All that unexpected Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. He had a tall pointed blue hat and a long gray cloak and a silver scarf, over which his long white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. "Good morning," said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining and the grass was very green, but Gandalf looked at him from under long bushy eyebrows that stuck further than the brim of his shady hat. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not, or that you feel good this morning, or that this is a morning to be good on?" "All of them at once," said Bilbo. "And a very fine morning for pipe tobacco out of doors, into the bargain. And if you have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine. There's no hurry, we have all day before us." Then Bilbo sat down on a seat by his door and crossed his legs and blew out a blue-gray ring of smoke that sailed up into the air without breaking and floating away over the hill. "Very pretty," said Gandalf, "but I have no time to blow smoke rings this morning. I'm looking for someone to share an adventure that I'm arranging, and it is very difficult to find anyone." "I should think so in these parts. We are plain and quiet folk, and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things. Make you late for dinner, and I can't think of what anyone sees in them," said our Mr. Baggins, and stuck one thumb behind his braces, and blew out another even bigger smoke ring. Then he took his morning letters and began to read, pretending to take no more notice of the old man. He decided that he was not quite his sort, and wanted him to go away. But the old man did not move. He stood leaning on his stick and gazing at the hobbit without saying anything, till Bilbo got quite uncomfortable, and even a little cross. "Good morning," he said at last. "We don't want any adventures here, thank you. You might try over the hill or across the water." By this he meant that the conversation was at an end. "What a lot of things you do use good morning for," said Gandalf. "Now you mean that you want to get rid of me, and that it won't be good until I move off." Not at all, dear sir. Let me see. I don't think I know your name." Yes, my dear sir, and I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and you do know my name, though you don't remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf." and Gandalf means me. To think that I should have lived to be good morninged by a belladonna took son, as if I was selling buttons at the door. Gandalf, Gandalf, good gracious me! Not the wandering wizard that gave old Took a pair of magic diamond studs that fastened themselves, and never came undone until ordered. Not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties about dragons and goblins and giants, and the rescue of princesses, and the unexpected luck of widows' sons. Not the man that used to make such particularly excellent fireworks. I remember those. Old Took used to have them on Midsummer's Eve. Splendid. They used to go up like great lilies and snapdragons and lambunums of fire and hanging in the twilight of evening. You will notice already that Mr. Baggins was not quite as prosy as he'd like to believe. Also, he was very fond of flowers. Dear me, he went on, not the Gandalf who's responsible for so many quiet lads and lasses going off into the blue for mad adventures, anything from climbing trees to visiting elves or sailing ships, sailing to other shores. Bless me, life used to be such a quite used to upset things badly in these parts once upon a time. I beg your pardon, but I had no idea you were still in business. Where else would I be? Said the wizard. All the same, I'm pleased to find you remember something about me. You seem to remember my fireworks kindly at any rate. And that's not without hope. Indeed, for your old grandfather Took's sake, and for the sake of poor Belladonna, I will give you what you asked for. I beg your pardon, I haven't asked for anything. Yes, you have, twice now, my pardon. I give it to you. In fact, I will go as far to send you on this adventure. Very amusing for me, very good for you, and profitable too. Very likely, if you ever get over it. Sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you. Not today. Good morning. But please, come to tea any time you like. Why not tomorrow? Come tomorrow. Goodbye. With that, the hobbit turned and scuttled inside his round green door and shut it as quickly as he dared, not to seem rude. Wizards, after all, are wizards. What on earth did I ask him to tea for? He said to himself as he went to the pantry. He had only just had breakfast, but he had thought a cake or two and a drink of something would do him good after his fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was standing outside the door, laughing long but quietly. After a while he stepped up, and with a spike on a staff scratched the queer sign on the hobbit's beautiful green front door. Then he strode away. Just about the time when Bilbo was finishing his second cake and beginning to think that he had escaped adventures very well. The next day he had almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well unless he put them down in his engagement tablet, like this: Gandalf, tea, Wednesday. Yesterday he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before tea time there came a tremendous ring on the front door bell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put on the kettle and put out another cup and saucer and an extra cake or two and ran to the door. I am so sorry to keep you waiting, he said. He was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf, with a blue beard tucked into his golden belt, and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door opened, he pushed inside as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg. Dwalin, at your service, he said with a low bow. Bilbo Baggins, at yours, said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence followed had become uncomfortable, he added, I'm just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me. A little stiff, perhaps. But he meant it kindly. And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung things up on your wall without a word of explanation? They had not been at the table long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third cake when there came another, even louder ring on the bell. Excuse me, said the hobbit, and he went to the door. So you have got here at last, and that is what he would have said to Gandalf this time. But it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open, as if he had been invited. "I see they've begun to arrive already," he said, when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it. "Balin, at your service," he said, with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as host, he knew his duty and stuck to it, however painful. He might have to go without. "Come along in and have some tea," he said. He managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better, if that's all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with his white beard. "But I don't mind some cake. Seed cake, if you have any." "Lots," said Bilbo, found himself answering. To his own surprise, he found himself scuttling off, too, to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then to the pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes, which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of him when a loud ring came at the bell again. And then another ring. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought, and he puffed along the passage. But it was not. It was 2 more dwarfs, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and spades. They had hopped in as soon as the door began to open, and Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarves?" he said. "Killy, at your service," said one. "And Filly," added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin here already, I see," said Killy. "Let us join the throng." "Throng," thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only just had a sip in the corner while the 4 dwarfs sat around the table and talked about mines and golds and troubles with goblins and the depredations of dragons and a lot of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous, when ding-dong, ding-a-ling-dang, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little Hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. Some 4, I should say by the sound," said Filly. "Besides, we saw them coming down behind us in the distance." The poor Hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and thought what had happened, and what was going to happen, and whether they'd all want to stay for supper. Then the bell rang again, louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all. It was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after the other. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were their names. And very soon 2 purple hoods, a gray hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were all hanging on the pegs. And off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, and some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them cakes, so it was the Hobbit kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had been set on the hearth, and the seed cakes were gone, and the dwarfs were starting on a round of buttered scones, when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the Hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging on it with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry, altogether bewildered and bewrothered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he would ever remember. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of the other. More dwarves. 4 more. And there was Gandalf behind him, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent in the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he had put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat, and then open the door like a pop gun. Let me introduce Bilfer, Beaufort, Bomber, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Bilfer, Beaufort, and Bomber, standing in a row. They hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf. In fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Bilfer, Beaufort, and Bomber on top of him. For one thing, Bomber was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin, indeed, was very haughty and said nothing about service. But poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray, don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now we are all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering, and I hope there is something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine for me, thanks. And for me. And raspberry jam and an apple tart," said Beaufort. "And mince pies and cheeses," said Beaufort. "And pork pie and salad," said Bomber. "And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarfs through the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," said Gandalf after him, and the hobbits stomped off to the pantries. "And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles." Seems to know as much as about the inside of my largest as I do myself," thought Mr. Baggins, who, feeling positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had gotten all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled on big trays, he was getting very hot, red in the face, and annoyed. "Confiscated and bebother these dwarves," he said. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" And lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin in the door to the kitchen, and Philly and Killy behind him, and before he knew he could say knife, they'd whisk away all the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlor and set everything out afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with 13 dwarves all around, and Bilbo sat at a stool at the fireside, nibbling on a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, trying to look as if it was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least bit of an adventure. The dwarfs ate and talked, and time went on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you'll all stay for supper?" he said, in his politest, unpressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin, "and after. We shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarfs, not Thorin, he was too important and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped up to their feet and made tall piles of all the things, and off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on top, with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking in fright, "Please be careful, and please don't trouble, I can manage." But the dwarfs only started to sing. I'm not singing for you guys, so I'll read it. "Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread the fat. Pour the milk on the pantry floor. Leave the bones on the bedroom mat. Splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocks of boiling bowl. Pound them up with thumping pole. And when you've finished, if any whole, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates, so carefully with the plates." And of course, they did none of those dreadful things, and everything was cleaned and put away safe as lightning when the hobbit turned around and round in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing. They went back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender, smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and whether he told one to go, it went up the chimney behind the clock, on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But whenever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He'd send a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe straight through each one of the thorns. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back, to hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud of them there already, and in the dim light, it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings. And then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of all the smoke rings he had sent up the wind over the hill. "Now for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out the instruments." And Killy and Billy rushed to their bags and brought back little fellows. Dory, Nori, and Ori brought out flutes somewhere inside their coats. Bomber produced a drum from the hall, and Bifer and Bofur went out too and came back with clarinets that they had left among the walking sticks. Dwellin and Balin said, "Excuse me, I left mine in the porch." "Just bring mine with you," said Thorin, and they came back with viols as big as themselves, and Thorin's harp wrapped in a green cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck it with the music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot everything else, and was swept away in dark lands under strange moons, far over the water, and very far from his hobbit hole in the hill. The dark came into the room in the little window that opened in the side of the hill, and the firelight flickered. It was April, and still they played on, while the shadows of Gandalf's beard waggled against the wall. The dark filled the room, and the fire died down, and the shadows were lost, and still they played on. And suddenly, first one and then another began to sing as they played, deep-throated singing of the dwarves in the deep places, their ancient homes. And this is like a fragment of their song, if it can be their song without their music. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to see the pale enchanted gold. The dwarves of yore made mighty spells, while hammers fell like ringing bells in places deep where dark things sleep, in hollowed halls beneath the fells. For ancient kings and elven lord, their many gleaming golden hoard, their shape and wrought, and light they caught to hide the gems on hilt of sword. On silver necks they strung, flowering stars on crowns they hung, the dragon fire and twisted wire they meshed, the light of moon and sun. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to climb the long-forgotten gold. Goblets they carved there themselves, and harps of gold, where no man delves. There lay long, and many a song was sung unheard of men and elves. The pines were roaring in the height, and the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, its flaming spread, the trees like torches blazing with light. The bells were ringing in the dale. The men looked up with faces pale. The dragon's ire, more fierce than fire, laid down their towers and houses frail. The mountain smoke beneath the moon, and dwarves they heard of tramping doom. They fled the halls of dying fall, beneath his feet, beneath the moon. For over the misty mountains grim, to dungeons deep and caverns dim, we must away ere break of day, to win our hearts and gold from him. As they sang, the hobbit fell in love with the beautiful things made by hands and by cunning and by magic moving through him. A fierce and jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something tookish woke inside of him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains, and hear the pine trees and waterfalls, and explore the caves, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. And he looked at the window. The stars were out in the darkest sky above the trees. He thought of the jewels of the dwarf shining in the dark caverns. Suddenly, in the wood beyond the water, a flame leapt up, probably someone lighting a wood fire, and he thought of plundering dragons, setting his quiet hill and kindling all flames, and he shuddered. Very quickly he was plain Mr. Baggins of Bag End under Hill again. He got up trembling. He had less than half a mind to fetch the lamp. and more than half a mind to pretend to, and go and hide beneath some barrels in the cellar, and not come out again until all the dwarfs had gone away. And suddenly he found that the music and singing had stopped, and they were all looking at him with eyes shining in the dark. "Where are you going?" said Thorin, in a tone that would show that he had guessed both halves of the hobbit's mind. "What about a little light?" said Bilbo apologetically. "We like the dark," said the dwarfs. "Dark for dark business, and there are many hours before dawn." "Of course," said Mr. Bilbo, and sat down in a hurry. He missed the stool, and sat in the fender, knocking over the poker and shovel with a crash. "Hush!" said Gandalf. "Let Thorin speak." And this is how Thorin began.